What began as one man trying to enter his own property turned into a showdown between an HOA president desperate for control and a homeowner backed by his former special ops brothers. The sound of tires crunching over the gravel driveway should have been the first satisfying moment of homecoming for Gregory Holt, a 42-year-old real estate developer who had just closed on the kind of property most people only dream about. But as his black Escalade slowed at the gate of his new mansion on the northern edge of Dallas, something instantly felt wrong. The gate wasn't opening. It wasn't even moving. Instead, 3 figures stood planted directly in front of it, blocking his way in. At the center was a woman who looked like she owned the entire block. Mid-50s, blonde hair, perfectly sculpted into a helmet of control. Navy suit jacket that screamed authority. Sandra Whitfield, president of the Homeowners Association, the type of leader people in the neighborhood tolerated, but never truly liked. To her right and left stood 2 men in polo shirts and khakis, the kind of enforcers who normally issued warnings about trash cans left on the curb too long. But here they were, standing shoulder to shoulder, like Gregory was some kind of intruder. Gregory rolled down his window halfway, trying to process what was happening. What's going on here? His tone was calm, but sharp enough to cut through the warm Texas air. Sandra crossed her arms. This community has strict standards. We don't let just anyone through these gates. I'll need proof of ownership before you set one tire past this point. Gregory blinked, caught off guard. He had the closing papers sitting in his briefcase on the passenger seat, but something about her delivery felt less like protocol and more like a personal test. "I just signed the papers yesterday," he replied. "This is my property, my gate, my driveway." Her lips curled into the faintest smirk. "You'll understand if I'm skeptical. We don't usually see people like you buying homes here." The sentence landed heavier than the Texas humidity. Gregory stared at her, eyes narrowing. But before he could respond, one of the men stepped forward. "Look, sir, we can stand here all day, or you can show us documents. Rules are rules." Gregory leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. He wasn't new to confrontation. Years of high-stakes deals, contractors trying to outmaneuver him, city councils throwing up roadblocks. He'd seen it all. But this wasn't about paperwork. This was about control, about power. From across the cul-de-sac, neighbors were starting to peek out from behind their manicured hedges. A mother tugged her son back inside as he pointed curiously toward the gate. Another neighbor lifted his phone, already recording. The air carried that prickly tension that spreads when people know they're watching something they shouldn't but can't look away from. Gregory unbuckled his seatbelt, pushed open the door, and stepped out of the Escalade. Standing 6'2", broad-shouldered, his presence shifted the tone of the standoff. He didn't need to puff his chest or raise his voice. His silence alone made the 2 men shift uneasily on their feet. "I've got nothing to prove to you," he said evenly. "But let's make this simple. You want to see papers? Fine. I'll show them. But remember this moment, because when I walk through that gate, it'll be as the rightful owner of this home." He turned back toward the car, but Sandra's voice lashed out again. "Don't play the victim here, Mr. Holt. Our community has a reputation to protect. We've worked too hard to keep standards high." Gregory froze mid-step and looked over his shoulder. His eyes met hers with a sharp steadiness that made even the enforcers glance at the ground. "Standards?" he repeated slowly. "Or prejudices?" The words cut through the quiet street. A couple across the road shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other. Another neighbor lifted his phone, already recording. One of the HOA men muttered under his breath, clearly wishing Sandra would back down. But Sandra didn't move. her chin lifted higher, her grip on control tightening, even as the situation slipped further from her hands. Gregory opened the passenger door and reached for his briefcase. But before he could pull out the folder with the closing documents, a line of headlights appeared at the end of the street. 3 SUVs rolled in, engines low and steady, pulling up behind his Escalade. Doors opened and men stepped out one by one. Not loud, not rushed, deliberate, quiet. The kind of quiet that told you they'd been here before, just in places far more dangerous than a suburban cul-de-sac. Gregory didn't have to introduce them. Their formation said everything. These weren't just old friends. These were his brothers from special operations, men he'd served with overseas, men who'd seen the worst of humanity. Sandra's smirk faltered. The 2 enforcers shifted again, suddenly realizing they were no longer the ones in control. Neighbors leaned further out of their doorways, phones raised higher. The mood at the gate had shifted in a single moment. But the real confrontation was only beginning. Gregory didn't speak right away. He didn't need to. The men standing behind him, broad shoulders, sharp eyes, steady stances, were the kind of presence that made even the boldest second-guess themselves. They weren't dressed for intimidation, jeans, plain t-shirts, sneakers, but their composure carried a weight the 2 HOA enforcers could never match. Sandra swallowed hard, but forced her chin higher, refusing to look rattled. She addressed Gregory directly, though her eyes flicked nervously toward the men. "Mr. Holt, I don't know who these people are, but this is a private matter between you and the HOA. Bringing outsiders into it doesn't change the rules." Gregory gave a short laugh, though there was no humor in it. "These aren't outsiders. They're family, and they're here because I invited them. That mansion behind your gate, that's my home, and tonight I'm welcoming the people who had my back when life was on the line. You think a flimsy HOA checkpoint is going to stop me from walking into my own house?" The taller of the 2 enforcers, a man named Brett Lanning, took a step forward. His jaw was tight, but his voice carried a note of hesitation. "Look, sir, let's just keep this civil. If you've got proof of ownership, let's see it then, and we'll get out of your way. No harm done." But Sandra snapped her head toward him. "No, Brett, this isn't just about papers. It's about protecting our community. If we start letting anyone who claims they own property drive through, what do you think happens next?" The smaller enforcer, Neil Foster, shifted uncomfortably, his hands gripping the strap of his clipboard like it was a lifeline. He muttered, "He literally has the keys. I mean, look at his car. That's not a rental." Sandra glared at him, shutting him down with a single look. Gregory's patience thinned. He pulled the leather briefcase from the Escalade and snapped it open. Inside, neatly stacked, were the papers from the closing. Every signature, every notarized page, every seal of approval from the county courthouse. He pulled out the top document and held it high enough for Sandra to see. "This is the deed," he said, "signed yesterday afternoon at the Tarrant County Clerk's office. You want to scrutinize it? Fine, but you've got 30 seconds before I put it away, roll through this gate, and call the sheriff if you keep standing in the way." For the first time, Sandra hesitated. Her hands twitched at her sides, itching to snatch the paper, but unwilling to reach for it under the watchful stares of Gregory's crew. Behind her, neighbors were openly filming now. A teenager on a bike coasted to a stop at the edge of the driveway, whispering to a friend, "Dude, this is crazy." Gregory's men didn't move. They didn't have to.
Their presence was enough to tip the balance. Sandra finally broke the silence. "I'll have to verify this with the board," she said tightly. "We can't just take your word." Gregory stepped closer, closing the gap between them until only the gate separated them. His voice dropped lower, steadier, every syllable weighted. "You're not hearing me. I'm not asking for permission. I'm telling you this. I own this home. And you standing here, blocking me, isn't about protecting a neighborhood. It's about trying to remind me that you think you control who belongs here, but you don't. Not anymore." Sandra's cheeks flushed crimson. Her enforcers looked anywhere but at her. Brett shifted his stance, clearly wishing he was somewhere else. Neil actually took a step back, muttering something that sounded suspiciously like an apology. Gregory turned and handed the deed back into his briefcase. He wasn't going to let Sandra handle it, not with her track record of twisting situations to her favor. He snapped the case shut with a sharp click that echoed louder than expected. Then he looked at his friends. "We're done waiting." The men stepped forward as one, moving with the quiet coordination of soldiers who'd done this 100 times in far worse conditions. They didn't threaten, they didn't shove, they simply walked closer, their presence filling the narrow stretch of road until Sandra had no choice but to give ground. The tension in the air was thick. Sandra opened her mouth, ready to protest again, but her words caught in her throat as Gregory pulled a small device from his pocket, a remote for the gate given to him at closing. He pressed it once. With a mechanical hum, the gates creaked and began to slide open. Gasps rippled through the crowd of neighbors. Sandra froze, speechless. Brett and Neil exchanged glances that spoke volumes. The fight was over. Gregory looked back at Sandra, his words hung in the air. As he climbed back into his Escalade, the SUVs behind him revved softly, ready to follow. The gates opened wider and the convoy rolled forward, leaving Sandra standing stiff in the glow of headlights, her authority cracking like glass. But Sandra wasn't the type to back down quietly, and the neighborhood hadn't seen the last of this fight. The convoy eased through the gate, but no one on the street moved. Phones were still up, recording. Porch lights flicked on one by one, like the neighborhood itself wanted a clearer view of what was happening. The sound of Gregory's Escalade rolling up the driveway should have marked the end of the confrontation. Instead, it only deepened the divide. Some neighbors whispered about how unfair the HOA had been, while others muttered that Sandra had every right to enforce standards. Sandra stayed frozen by the gate, her arms stiff at her sides. Brett and Neil flanked her, though both looked like they'd rather vanish into the pavement. Brett finally broke the silence. "You saw the papers. He had the remote. That should be enough, Sandra." Her eyes snapped to him, cold and sharp. "Don't second-guess me. Not in front of them." She motioned toward the handful of neighbors still gathered. Neil shifted, his clipboard now hanging limply at his side. "He wasn't lying. You felt it, didn't you? That wasn't some guy sneaking in. He belongs here." Sandra didn't respond. Instead, she turned on her heel and strode toward her SUV, parked at the corner, her heels striking the pavement with a force that echoed in the night. Brett and Neil lingered behind, avoiding each other's gaze. Up the driveway, Gregory pulled to a stop in front of the mansion's arched entryway. The house was a symbol of years of grinding work, failed projects turned around, and deals negotiated until midnight. But instead of joy, he felt an ache of disappointment. He dreamed of this night, stepping into his home for the first time, friends at his side, ready to celebrate. Instead, He'd been treated like an outsider at his own gate. One of his crew, Marcus Devereux, a stocky man with a shaved head and an easy grin that rarely faded, broke the silence. "Man, I've seen checkpoints in Afghanistan that were friendlier than that." The others chuckled softly, but the humor was thin. Gregory forced a smile. "They wanted a show, we gave them one. Now let's not let them ruin the night." Another teammate, Isaac Moreno, leaned against the hood of his SUV, his eyes still on the street. "They're still watching. Half the neighborhood probably has this on Facebook already." Gregory sighed. "Let them watch. Maybe it'll remind them I'm not going anywhere." But he knew it wasn't that simple. Once a community decides someone doesn't belong, every move is scrutinized. He'd seen it in boardrooms, in politics, even in his old neighborhood growing up. It didn't matter how much money you had or what papers you held. Some people just wanted to remind you they held the gate keys, literal or not. Back at the gate, Sandra's SUV roared to life, but she didn't leave. Instead, she rolled her window down and spoke sharply to Brett and Neil. "This isn't over. Tomorrow morning I want reports on my desk. We'll call an emergency board meeting. If he thinks a piece of paper means he can bypass community standards, he's in for a surprise." Neil frowned. What standards did he break? Sandra owning the house? Having friends? Her lips pressed thin. "You don't understand how these things work. If we lose control now, we'll never get it back." Brett ran a hand over his face, weariness settling in. Control or pride? Sandra didn't answer. She hit the gas and sped off down the street, her taillights vanishing into the dark. Inside the mansion, Gregory's men followed him through the double doors into a wide foyer with marble floors and high ceilings. The place smelled of fresh paint and polished wood, untouched by life until now. Normally it would have been awe-inspiring. Instead, the silence felt heavy. Isaac set down a bottle of bourbon he'd brought as a gift. "We came to celebrate, brother. Not to sit here and stew over some HOA queen. Let's raise a glass." At least Gregory managed a real smile this time. He poured drinks, handed them out, and tried to push the sour taste of the encounter aside. They clinked glasses, the sound echoing in the empty space. "To new beginnings," Marcus said. "To holding your ground," Isaac added. Gregory lifted his glass last. "To never letting anyone decide where we belong." They drank the burn of the bourbon cutting through the weight of the evening. But the celebration never quite found its rhythm. Every so often, Gregory caught his men glancing toward the windows, the faint glow of neighbors' cameras still visible outside. Sandra hadn't won tonight, but she hadn't given up either. Gregory could feel it. This was only the start of a fight he hadn't asked for. The following morning, the air in the neighborhood carried a different charge. Word of the confrontation had spread like wildfire. Videos had already circulated online, snippets of Sandra squaring off with Gregory at the gate. Some captions were blunt, "HOA president blocks new homeowner," while others painted Gregory as an outsider forcing his way in. By sunrise, opinions had hardened. Gregory woke early. He stood on the balcony of his new home, looking out across the manicured lawns of the community. He wanted to feel proud, but instead he felt scrutinized. Even at that hour, a jogger slowed to a near stop in front of the property, glancing up as if to confirm for herself that the man in the video was really living there. Inside the house was alive with the low rumble of his friends, making coffee and swapping stories in the kitchen. But their laughter was undercut by the awareness that the neighborhood was watching. Gregory's phone buzzed on the counter with a text from a neighbor he'd never met. "So what happened last night? You don't deserve that welcome to the neighborhood?" Not long after, the sound of tires announced another visitor.
A black sedan rolled to a stop in front of his driveway. Sandra stepped out, clipboard in hand, dressed in another pressed suit, ready for war. With her were Brett and Neil, looking less confident than the night before. Gregory opened the front door before she could knock. "Didn't expect to see you again so soon," he said flatly. Sandra gave a tight smile. "Mr. Holt, we need to talk about—" "What?" He crossed his arms. "I showed you the deed. That gate opened. End of story." She ignored his tone and stepped onto the porch. "The board met this morning. Emergency session. We reviewed the situation, and there are several violations we need to discuss." Gregory arched a brow. "Violations? I moved in yesterday." Sandra lifted her clipboard and flipped through papers. "Parking multiple large vehicles overnight without prior approval. Hosting a gathering without notifying the association. And the display of military equipment on private property." Gregory cut her off with a laugh, sharp and humorless. "Military equipment? You mean my friends? They're human beings, not tanks." Behind him, Marcus and Isaac appeared in the doorway, mugs of coffee in hand. Marcus spoke first. "You trying to regulate how many friends a man can have?" Over Sandra's composure slipped, but she pressed forward. "This isn't personal. These are community standards. They exist for a reason." Gregory stepped closer, lowering his voice. "No, Sandra, this is personal. You didn't question my paperwork because you were worried about standards. You questioned it because you didn't like what you saw when I rolled down that window." Her jaw clenched. She opened her mouth, but Brett interjected quietly. "He's not wrong, Sandra." Neil looked away, muttering, "Feels like we crossed a line." Sandra's eyes flared at both men, but she didn't break. She raised her chin and jabbed a finger at Gregory. "You think you can undermine me in my own neighborhood? I've been president of this association for 10 years. I know every homeowner, every car, every yard that's out of place. People trust me to keep things in order. You think you can walk in here and treat me like the enemy?" Gregory didn't flinch. "I don't think, I know. Because last night, in front of the whole street, you treated me like I didn't belong. You called it standards. Everyone else saw what it really was." The silence that followed was louder than shouting. Neighbors were gathering again, some pretending to water their lawns, others openly filming from the sidewalk. Sandra finally snapped. "You may have won last night, but I'm not finished. The HOA has power, Mr. Holt. Don't forget that." Gregory's voice dropped lower, steadier. "And don't you forget this. Power means nothing without respect. You can write up violations all day, but at the end of it, you'll still be the person who tried to stop a man from walking into his own home." The words cut deeper than any insult. Brett shifted uneasily. Neil muttered another apology under his breath. Sandra turned sharply, retreating toward her car, her heels striking the driveway in rapid clicks. Gregory's men lingered in the doorway as he stood on the porch watching her go. His chest was tight, not from anger, but from exhaustion. He wanted to celebrate his new beginning, yet here he was, locked in a battle he never asked for. Isaac broke the tension. "She's not letting this go. You know that, right?" Gregory nodded. "Yeah, but neither am I."
But while Sandra was plotting her next move,
Gregory's past and the people who shared it were about to remind the neighborhood what loyalty really looked like. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the driveways of the neighborhood. Most evenings, this street looked like the cover of a lifestyle magazine. Sprinklers misting over green lawns, porch lights flicking on in perfect rhythm, kids riding bikes until their parents called them in for dinner. But that night, the calm was broken again. Gregory was on the front porch with Marcus and Isaac, going over plans to unpack the last of the moving boxes when the deep growl of engines rolled down the street. This time, it wasn't just the 3 SUVs from the night before. It was a convoy. 4 trucks, windows down, headlights cutting through the dusk, pulling into the cul-de-sac with the kind of precision that comes from shared history. Outstepped men and women Gregory hadn't seen in months, some in jeans, others in button-downs, but all carrying themselves with that same quiet confidence. Former special ops, all of them. Brothers and sisters he'd served overseas. People who'd lived through fire and chaos and still came home with loyalty stitched into their bones. The first out was Carla Jennings, tall, sharp-eyed, her dark hair tied back. She walked straight up the driveway, pulling Gregory into a hug that spoke louder than words. "Heard you had some trouble at the gate," she said, her voice carrying just enough bite to make Marcus chuckle. "Word travels fast," Gregory replied. "Too fast," Isaac added. "Pretty sure the whole internet's watching now." Behind Carla came Damian Brooks, broad-shouldered, a grin spreading across his face as he spotted Gregory. "Man, you get a mansion and the welcome wagon is a firing squad. Figures." They all laughed, but it was the kind of laughter that cut tension rather than came from joy. Within minutes, the porch was crowded with familiar faces, old friends reconnecting, swapping quick stories, but their eyes kept drifting toward the street, where neighbors had started gathering again. Some were curious, some were worried, and some, especially those loyal to Sandra, looked outright hostile. It didn't take long before the HOA presence returned. Sandra's silver SUV rolled slowly down the street, headlights off, creeping like a cat ready to pounce. She stopped at the curb in front of Gregory's home and stepped out, her posture stiff, her lips pressed thin. Brett and Neil followed reluctantly, looking even less eager this time. She took in the sight of the porch, nearly a dozen people, all standing shoulder to shoulder with Gregory, and for the first time, her confidence faltered. But she covered it quickly with a raised voice. "This is exactly what I warned the board about,"
Sandra announced loud enough for every neighbor to hear. Excessive vehicles, disruptive gatherings, a threat to the safety and peace of this community. Damien crossed his arms and looked her up and down. "Lady, we're veterans. We've kept people safe on streets a lot more dangerous than this one." Carla stepped forward next, her eyes locked on Sandra's. "You're worried about safety? Maybe start with not blocking people from their own property." Sandra's cheeks flushed red. "You have no authority here." Gregory finally spoke, his voice calm but unshakable. "Neither do you. Not anymore. Every one of these people is here because I invited them. They don't need your approval. And the neighbors watching right now, they can see who's really trying to tear this place apart." Brett shuffled uncomfortably, whispering, "Maybe we should go, Sandra." But Sandra wasn't ready to leave. She took a step closer, jabbing her finger toward Gregory. "You think you can rally an army and intimidate your way into respect? This is my neighborhood, my rules. You don't scare me." Carla let out a sharp laugh. "Scare you, lady? No one here has even raised their voice. You're scared of something else,
And it's not us. For a moment, the entire street was silent. Neighbors stopped pretending to water their lawns. Children leaned against their parents wide-eyed. Even the cicadas seemed to hush. Sandra's face tightened, but she sensed the shift. She wasn't the authority anymore. She was the spectacle. Her words weren't commands, they were desperate, and everyone could see it. Gregory stepped down from the porch, closing the space between them. His voice stayed low, firm. This stops now. You don't get to decide who belongs here. You don't get to treat me like I'm a trespasser on my own property. If you keep pushing this, it won't be an HOA issue anymore. It'll be a legal one, and you'll lose. Sandra's hands trembled, though she tried to hide it. She glanced at Brett and Neil, but neither moved to support her. They looked at the ground, unwilling to share her fight. With the eyes of the neighborhood on her, Sandra finally turned back toward her SUV. Her heels clicked against the pavement, sharp and quick. The convoy of Gregory's friends didn't celebrate. They didn't gloat. They simply stood quiet and steady, as if to say, "We're here, and we're not going anywhere." But while Sandra had been forced to step back, Gregory knew she wasn't finished. And neither was the neighborhood. That night, the neighborhood didn't sleep easily. Porch lights stayed on later than usual. Blinds were tilted, just enough for people to peek through. And phones buzzed with messages flying back and forth in private group chats. The videos of Sandra and Gregory were no longer just clips circulating online. They were the talk of every driveway, kitchen table, and backyard in the community. Some neighbors admitted quietly to their spouses that Sandra had gone too far. Others said Gregory had brought it on himself by arriving with a show of force. But no matter the side, everyone knew something fundamental had shifted. Sandra, the woman who once ran the HOA like her personal kingdom, had been humbled in front of the very people she claimed to represent. The next morning,
Deep, serious, documentary-style true crime narration. Gregory drove to a cafe in Plano to clear his head. He needed space away from the mansion and the stairs. Sitting with a cup of black coffee, he scrolled through the flood of online chatter. One video had already cracked 10,000 views, reposted with captions like "HOA president tries to block new owner" and "Special Ops crew steps in." Some comments praised him for standing tall, while others dripped with cynicism, suggesting he was stirring conflict for attention. He set the phone down, rubbed his temples, and muttered to himself, "Day 2 and I'm already a headline?" Back at the neighborhood, Sandra was far from silent. She'd called a handful of loyal residents to her home for what she described as an emergency strategy meeting. Around her polished oak dining table, she laid out printed screenshots of Gregory's deed, clips of the confrontation, and a copy of the HOA bylaws. "Do you see what he's doing?" she said, her voice rising with each word. "He's trying to paint me as the villain. But this isn't about me, it's about protecting the standards we've built here." A neighbor named Tricia Lambert, known for always siding with Sandra at board meetings, nodded quickly. "We can't let him turn this place into some spectacle. What if property values drop? What if the wrong kind of attention keeps coming?" But another board member, Gerald Knox, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Sandra, I watched the videos. The man showed his deed. He had the gate remote. You can't keep acting like he doesn't belong." Sandra slammed her palm on the table, making the glasses rattle. "He humiliated me in front of everyone. If I let this go, I lose every ounce of authority I've built.
Do you want this community to spiral into chaos?" Her words hung heavy in the air. Tricia nodded again, but Gerald leaned back, his silence saying more than words. Meanwhile, Gregory returned home to find a small group of neighbors waiting near his driveway. A couple in their 60s, Howard and Denise Carter, approached him cautiously. Howard cleared his throat before speaking. "Mr. Holt," he said, voice careful but genuine, "we wanted to welcome you properly last night. That wasn't right. Not everyone here feels the way Sandra does." Gregory studied them, searching their faces for signs of condescension, but found only sincerity. He nodded slowly. "I appreciate that. I didn't buy this home to fight battles. I bought it to live in peace." Denise offered a plate of cookies wrapped in foil, her hands slightly trembling. "We hope you'll give the neighborhood a chance." Gregory accepted with a small smile. "Thank you. That means more than you know." From the porch, Marcus watched the exchange with folded arms. Once the couple left, he muttered, "Some are with you, some are against you, just like always." Gregory exhaled. "Yeah, and Sandra's not finished. She's cornered, and cornered people always strike back." He was right. That evening, Sandra called another meeting, this time with the full HOA board. She arrived with a new agenda: to draft fines against Gregory for unauthorized gatherings and security concerns. Gerald pushed back immediately.
This is personal, Sandra. We all see it. You're not protecting the community. You're protecting your ego. Her eyes flashed. If you can't support the rules, Gerald, maybe you don't belong on this board. A heavy silence followed. Even Tricia shifted uncomfortably. This time, Sandra had gone from confident leader to someone clawing for control, and the cracks were starting to show. Back on Gregory's porch, his friends gathered again as the street grew darker. The atmosphere was calmer than the night before, but tension still lingered. The neighbors who supported him waved as they passed. Those loyal to Sandra avoided eye contact. Gregory sipped a glass of bourbon, staring out at the street. But the moment that storm arrived, Gregory's resolve and the loyalty of his friends would be tested in ways the neighborhood never expected. The HOA board meeting wasn't usually the kind of event that drew a crowd. In most neighborhoods, those evenings were dry, filled with talk of landscaping, budgets, and pool maintenance. But this time, it was different. Word had spread like wildfire that Sandra was calling a special session to address violations, and half the community showed up, some to support her, others to see if Gregory would push back. The meeting took place at the community center, just a block from the mansion. Rows of folding chairs filled the room, and a buzz of conversation lingered in the air. At the front, Sandra sat with her gavel, her face set in stone. Tricia was on her left, Gerald on her right, and the rest of the board fanned out beside them. Gregory didn't come alone. He entered with Marcus, Carla, and Damien, their steady presence drawing more stares than whispers. He wasn't trying to intimidate, but their unity was undeniable. Neighbors leaned over to each other, whispering, as the four of them walked down the aisle and took seats in the front row. Sandra slammed her gavel. "This meeting is called to order. We have a matter of community concern that requires immediate attention." She launched into her statement, rattling off supposed violations: unauthorized gathering, parking congestion, disruption of community standards. Each phrase was delivered with rehearsed confidence, as if reading charges in a courtroom. Gregory raised his hand. "I'd like to respond." Sandra's eyes narrowed. "This is not a debate. This is the board addressing violations." Gerald cleared his throat. "Actually, Sandra, he's entitled to respond. That's procedure." Her jaw tightened, but she gestured stiffly. "Fine, you may speak." Gregory stood slowly, his frame towering in front of the crowd. His voice wasn't raised, but it carried to the back of the room. "Yesterday, I moved into my home.
I was met at my own gate by the HOA president and 2 enforcers who blocked me from entering. I showed proof of ownership, and I was still denied that. That's not enforcing standards, that's harassment." Gasps rippled through the room. A few neighbors nodded in agreement. Sandra slammed the gavel again. "That's a distortion of events." Gregory held up a hand. "There are videos. The whole neighborhood saw it. Some of you even filmed it. So let's not pretend it didn't happen. This isn't about cars in a driveway. This is about someone deciding who does and doesn't belong here."
The silence that followed was heavy. Neighbors shifted in their seats, uncomfortable. Even Tricia glanced at Sandra, unsure. Damien leaned forward in his chair, his voice cutting through. "If this board wants to fine him, then find us too. We were there. We were the unauthorized gathering." "You going to police friendship now?" Carla added. "You claim this is about safety, but the only unsafe thing I saw was an HOA president standing in front of a man's car, blocking him from his own house." Sandra's voice shook as she fired back. "You don't understand how this works. This is about rules, about protecting what we've built here." Gerald finally snapped. "Protecting what, Sandra? Property values or your pride? Because right now you're dragging this whole neighborhood into a fight no one asked for." The crowd erupted, some clapping, others murmuring in support. Sandra banged her gavel over and over, but her authority was slipping with every strike. Gregory looked directly at her. "I didn't move here to fight. I moved here to live, to work, to build a life. You made it personal when you stood at my gate, and I'm telling you right now, it stops today." Sandra's lips trembled, but she held her ground. "You think you can shame me into silence? You think you can parade your friends around until I back down? I've been president for 10 years, and I don't bow to intimidation." Gregory's response was steady, quiet, almost disarming. "I'm not asking you to bow. I'm asking you to do the job you claim to love. Protect this neighborhood. That means protecting everyone in it, even me." The room was silent. Neighbors looked between Sandra and Gregory, weighing every word. The tension cracked when an older woman in the back, Martha Higgins, spoke up. "Enough, Sandra. He owns that house. He belongs here. Let it go before you tear this community apart." The applause that followed wasn't thunderous, but it was steady, and it wasn't for Sandra. Sandra's face turned crimson. Her gavel struck once more. "Meeting adjourned," she barked, before storming out. Tricia hurrying after her. Gerald stayed behind, his eyes meeting Gregory's with something like quiet respect. Gregory sat back down. But what Gregory didn't know was that Sandra's next move would be her boldest yet, and it would force the neighborhood to choose sides, once and for all. 2 days after the board meeting, the neighborhood felt like a pressure cooker. Conversations weren't casual anymore. They were whispered, sharp, split down the middle. On one side were those who thought Gregory had exposed something ugly about the way things were being run. On the other were those who clung to Sandra's authority.
Unwilling to admit she'd crossed the line, Gregory tried to keep life moving forward. He spent his mornings unpacking, his afternoons walking the property with Conte, contractors to plan renovations, and his evenings catching up with his crew. But no matter how hard he tried to focus, the eyes of the neighborhood followed him everywhere. Joggers slowed when they passed. Kids riding scooters stopped and stared until their parents called them inside. Even deliveries were watched like small spectacles. On the third evening, it came to a head. Gregory returned from Home Depot with Marcus to find a bright orange notice taped to his gate. Bold letters screamed, HOAVIOLATION, notice.
The charges? Unauthorized use of property, security risk to residents, and most absurdly, failure to maintain neighborhood harmony. Marcus tore the notice down and shook his head. They're not even trying to hide it anymore. She's weaponizing the rules. Gregory ran a hand over his face, exhaling hard. She's desperate. But this isn't just about me now. If she can twist the rules like this for me, she'll do it to anyone. Before he could say more, a small crowd began forming at the curb. Neighbors had seen the notice. Some whispered, some recorded. And then, almost on cue, Sandra's silver SUV pulled up. She stepped out with the confidence of someone who believed she was still in charge. Brett and Neil trailed behind her, though they looked less enthusiastic than ever. Sandra raised her voice, addressing not just Gregory, but the entire gathering. This is proof that no one is above the rules. Mr. Holt has repeatedly defied our bylaws, hosting unauthorized assemblies, intimidating board members, and disrupting the peace of this neighborhood. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A man shouted, "That's not true," while another muttered, "She's right, we don't want a circus here." Gregory stepped forward, holding the crumbled violation notice in his hand. "This," he said, holding it up for everyone to see, "this is a lie. Every word. I moved in less than a week ago, and somehow I'm already being accused of destroying harmony. You all know what's really happening here." Sandra's voice sharpened. "What's happening here is accountability. If you can't respect the standards of this community, maybe you chose the wrong neighborhood." Carla, standing just behind, couldn't hold back. Standards or prejudice, wrapped up in paperwork. The crowd erupted again, some clapping, some booing. Phones shot up higher, recording every second. Gregory turned slowly, addressing the neighbors directly. His voice was calm, but every word carried weight. Ask yourselves this. If it was you, if tomorrow Sandra stood at your gate and told you that you didn't belong, that your friends weren't welcome, that your very presence was a threat, what would you do? Would you roll over, or would you stand up? A murmur spread through the crowd. Howard and Denise Carter, the elderly couple who had brought cookies days earlier, stepped forward. Howard raised his hand. "We saw it. We were there." Gregory showed his papers, and Sandra still refused to let him in. "That's not leadership. That's control." Others began nodding. A younger neighbor spoke up. "I've lived here 3 years. I've never seen anyone treated like that at the gate. Not once." Sandra's face flushed, her control slipping with every word spoken against her. "You're letting him manipulate you. He's turning you against your own board." Gerald Knox, who had been standing quietly in the back, finally stepped forward. "No, Sandra, you did that yourself. This community trusted you to represent us. Instead, you turned the HOA into your personal weapon. That ends now." The crowd broke into applause, louder this time, stronger. The shift was unmistakable. Sandra stood frozen, her authority crumbling in the very place she once commanded without question. Gregory lowered the violation notice and let it fall to the pavement. He looked Sandra in the eye. "You wanted to fight in front of everyone. Here it is, and everyone can see who's telling the truth." For a long moment, Sandra didn't move. Her face was pale, her hands clenched tight at her sides. The night after the violation standoff, the neighborhood was unusually quiet. No gatherings on driveways, no kids laughing on scooters, no porch conversations about weekend plans. The confrontation had left a mark, and everyone knew it. The community wasn't united anymore.
It was split clean down the middle. Inside the mansion, Gregory sat at the long dining table with his friends scattered around him. Plates of half-eaten takeout sat forgotten, drinks untouched. For once, the room wasn't filled with their usual banter. Instead, there was a heavy silence, the kind that comes when the weight of a fight presses on everyone's shoulders. Carla broke it first. "She's losing ground. You saw it. Half the neighborhood clapped for you last night. She can't hold on forever." Gregory leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the chandelier above. "Maybe, but people like her don't go quietly. She'll find another angle." Marcus tapped the table with his finger. "Then you beat her at her own game. She wants to use the bylaws? Fine. You learn them better than she does. You fight her where she thinks she's strongest." Isaac shook his head. "That's one way. But maybe you don't fight at all. Maybe you win them over, not with paperwork, with presence. Show them you're not what she says you are." Gregory considered both points. He wasn't just dealing with Sandra anymore. He was dealing with the story. She was trying to write about him, and the only way to rewrite it was through action. The next morning, he acted. Instead of avoiding the neighbors, he stepped directly into their world. He waved at joggers. He stopped to talk with the family across the street. When he saw kids playing basketball near the cul-de-sac, he asked if he could take a shot, sinking one cleanly to a chorus of cheers. Word spread quickly. Gregory wasn't hiding. He wasn't sulking behind mansion walls. He was present, approachable, real. And slowly, faces that once looked at him with suspicion softened. That evening, Howard and Denise Carter knocked on his door again. They weren't alone this time. With them were two younger families, neighbors Gregory hadn't officially met yet. They stood awkwardly at first. Then Denise spoke. "We just wanted to say we're sorry for how you were treated. This community isn't supposed to be like that. You've been nothing but respectful since you arrived."